Yeah, and it's interesting what you're saying about the kind of how it can in some ways be formalized and categorized more effectively. I mean, if that's where I see the divergence between the use of technology for goods and materials versus services procurement, because obviously, as you said, goods and materials very catalog driven. It's quite binary. It either is this or it isn't this. Whereas with services, it's just so much more complex. There are obviously those shades of grey, and I think there are certain elements of how a statement of work should be written within a particular organization that can be captured and used to inform the process and help people make use of that channel or use that channel more effectively or control the use of that channel more effectively. But I think there's also potentially some real expertise input that can be given to just help people write better requirements. And I think that comes down to, within the organization, it comes down to potentially opportunities for the MSP to really help with that. But I also feel that the supplier can potentially be a very valuable part of that. How do you see that stacking up in the sense that, for example, if it's a really specific piece of work where the supplier owns the expertise?
Yeah, I'll come on to the supplier in a second if I can, but just to wrap up one bit you mentioned there around sort of creating the control and that expertise of helping build those SOWs. I think that actually the biggest thing that's driven by should be the maturity of the organization. So if you're an organization, and we're talking here, I guess, like the buying maturity of the organization. If you're an organization with quite low levels of maturity, you've probably not got a lot of control of the process. You've probably not got a lot of people following the process if there is a process there. And what you really need there to move yourself along is more rigid ways of doing things. You want it standardizing in a system. You want to have template contracts. You almost want the business unit not to get too involved in the contract, just to come to you and say, well, this is what I want doing, and then you're going to use your expertise to build that for them. As you progress down that maturity journey into something a little bit more advanced, I think you should be giving some of that power back to the business unit in the form of empowerment rather than lack of control. And therefore, you should be looking at ways of working, processes, policies, tools that facilitate the business users building a lot of their own deals, but with the information, with the tool sets available to them and the education to build really great deals.
Yeah, and we certainly see that from a tech point of view, in the sense that, the self-service element of technology to manage services procurement is absolutely critical. The ability for users within the business to be able to do that. And
that self-service would be potentially dangerous in in an environment where it's not suited to it, where there's nobody's got a clue what they're buying, how they're buying it, whether they should be buying it or not. But in the right environment, for an organization who's probably been acting in this centralized way for a few years, and people learned the value of procurement, learned the importance of sticking to the rules, potentially in a regulated environment, so there's a bit more of a culture of that. That self-service is really empowering the business users there. And also what it's also doing is getting you more buy-in. And I suspect you guys probably see this in terms of uptake.
Yeah.
Most procurement organizations probably at best get about 70% of total spend flowing through themselves, of spend that should have flowed through them. And even that would be considered quite decent. And I think there's 3 reasons why people don't engage procurement. I know better. I don't want to spend any time on it, or I've got something to hide. And if you're able to empower people to approach the market themselves, build deals themselves, see the data that helps them make better buying decisions themselves, assuming it's right for the culture of your organization, you take off the table that I know better and I haven't got time for it arguments, and therefore you should get more spend throughput.
Yeah, definitely. And what we tend to see is that the level of control that you may want to layer on, for example, through a tool like ours, depends on the maturity of the organization. It also depends on the culture of the organization. Some organizations would just, it's just people aren't told what to do. They just, they're independent and they get on and do it. That doesn't mean that, having self-service access, for example, through a system that's guided by input, for example, from an MSP, that is no reason why that can't still lay out a useful path for them. So, for example, allowing self-service, but having that as effectively a guided process where you might have templates and you might have certain fields that are configured in certain ways that aid that process, I think can be really useful. And then procurement can layer on as much or as little control as they may want. because the most important thing, as you rightly said, is getting that uptake initially.
Yeah.
Without the data and the process flowing right through, then you really don't get the insights and the value at the end of it. But I think also there's one of the points you brought up there is quite an interesting one, just with regards to, for example, templating the contractual process, or at least having a structure around that. And I kind of see this part of it as two bits. I see it as the requirement, and then there's the work order or the statement of work. So one of the things that I think some organizations or some stakeholders find quite difficult is actually just communicating that requirement out to the market. And there's a skill to doing that. And there's also a skill to then formulating the scope of work and the work order. And I think some companies are quite wary of getting suppliers too involved in that, because it might feel like the tail wagging the dog, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy and all this sort of thing. But equally, if there is a sensible process with back and forth there, I think not the writing the initial requirement, but when it comes to shaping the work order, that can be a really collaborative process. But yeah. I guess from an MSP service point of view, there are opportunities to add value and get involved when it comes to actually just guiding people through requirements. I mean, we sometimes see situations where even a requirement will go through a sign-off process before it even goes anywhere else, and it will be refined. And I think there's maybe quite a bit of value that can be added at that point, but then also at kind of maybe refereeing or helping with the scope of work decision point.
Yeah. What the MSP will often do, or the service procurement provider will often do in that early stage, is help the business user, first of all, just really start to articulate their requirements and start to think about what they want to get done rather than what they think needs to get done. So what's the goal? I need this integration building by Christmas. Often, even if that's the aim, the first engagement will involve somebody coming to the team and saying, "Hey, look, I need 4 people for 6 months." Okay, well, what is it you're trying to achieve? What does good look like? How do we articulate that? That's the first task. Because once you've got that down, you've got a fighting chance of finding somebody in the market who's going to commit to delivering those results. There's absolutely value in the vendor base getting involved in that, because if you alone set the outcome criteria, you're potentially going to miss some innovative solutions. I think I need an integration, but actually somebody else in the market might be able to tell me a different way of solving the problem. So there is value in engaging with the market there, but the biggest value just comes with sitting with somebody who's approaching the market on a day-to-day basis and saying, okay, these are the ways we're going to describe what you want to get done. This is how we're going to use the contract to ensure that various sort of quality levels are achieved. This is how we can link the risk to the contract, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of what the team will be spending a lot of their time doing, and also just ensuring that one of the highest points of value in this whole process is tracking what happened after the SOW was executed. But you really need to be the stuff you're doing beforehand is what's going to set you up for success in tracking that. So well constructed, relatively standardized, but still detailed statements of work, clearly articulated requirements, acceptance criteria, payment terms, milestones, and so on and so forth. That's what's going to set you up for building great data at the back end. So one of the things that program teams will often do is spend a lot of time with the user in the business, really getting that down to the perfect level of detail.